There are major changes coming to Square Enix. We've already seen this with the sweeping layoffs, and a lot of this has to do with the fact that they have some brand new investors who have purchased a significant stake in the company. With them currently owning 15%, this makes them the second largest shareholder of Square, with the largest holder overall being Yasuhiro Fukushima, who is also the founder of Enix, and he owns roughly 19 to 20% of the shares, which means it would be really easy for 3D investment partners to become the biggest shareholder of Square Enix. As a result, their influence on the company cannot be understated. Just recently, they put out a report saying everything they think is wrong with Square Enix, including supposed sales estimates for games like Final Fantasy XVI, as well as the cost to develop them. And while people are speculating heavily on these numbers, one thing remains certain: this is going to have an extreme impact on Final Fantasy and the whole of Square Enix going forward. So please go ahead and hit that subscribe button. I have a goal of reaching 110k subscribers before the end of this summer, so go ahead and help us out along the way. So first, we have to start with who this big new investor is and why they're demanding so many changes. That investor is 3D Investment Partners, and they first started purchasing stake in Square Enix earlier this year. This Singaporean-based company is what's known as an activist investor. And to be clear here, no, not that type of activism. An activist investor is a fund that buys significant stake in a company specifically to push management to change strategy and unlock shareholder value, as they say. So these investors buy stake in companies like Square Enix, then apply pressure for restructuring, all to achieve better overall returns. In other words, activist investors buy stake in companies that they think aren't making enough money and then try to make them significantly more profitable. And they released a 122-page document on what they think is wrong with Square Enix. Their points can essentially be boiled down to the fact that the games aren't selling enough and that the games cost too much to make, with a lot of comparisons to Capcom and their performance. And so far, none of this is disagreeable. I think most of us can agree that Capcom is killing it right now. Every game may not be perfect, but for the most part, they're putting out consistently high-quality titles back to back. Not to mention that these games are selling incredibly well, and games that they released almost a decade ago are still pushing units. Capcom is definitely seeing its golden era right now, both for fans and shareholders. However, there are some straight-up disingenuous comparisons here, such as the slide on page 52 that highlights the weak performance of new releases. It makes complete and total sense to compare Final Fantasy 15 and 16, even if you personally believe that the entire reason the game didn't sell as well as Final Fantasy 15 is purely due to exclusivity. From a business perspective, that's still worth talking about as for why the business isn't being ran as well as it could. So yes, 15 to 16, entirely fair comparison. However, comparing Dragon Quest XI to Dragon Quest III Remake just seems entirely disingenuous. Why are we comparing a brand new mainline Dragon Quest to an HD 2D remake? One that sold relatively well, by the way. This also being said, it says that these numbers are the numbers as of May 2025, and they have Final Fantasy XVI at 3.23 million total sales. Now, if you guys thought the previous estimate that it was 3.5 million in sales was too low, this is even lower. It was announced during the first week of Final Fantasy XVI's launch that it had shipped and sold digitally 3 million units. While I find it really hard to believe that this number is accurate, because remember, this is coming from a third-party source and not necessarily Square Enix, which means that these numbers should not be inherently treated as official. But if this number did end up being true, it would mean that the shipped and sold digitally would be doing a lot of carrying here. It would mean that Final Fantasy XVI has sold virtually nothing since the first week. And to be fair, Square Enix has been incredibly quiet with the title. Perhaps there's never been an announcement on full 4 or 5 million because it just simply has never even broken past 3 million. The lack of a sales update could make sense when there just is nothing to actually even update. This makes me think of something Yoshi P said when he went on Weekly Ochi. So this is a Japanese talk show, and he went on just a couple weeks before the launch of Final Fantasy 16. And on it, he was asked, "This might be a weird question to ask, but since you have put so much passion and effort into creating this game, when it comes to management, how do you think about the sales aspect here? Read, translated into profits and sales, in terms of timing and your target audience and so on, Yoshi P. So when it comes to product, when I first submit my proposal, it's a given that I would attach together with the budget documentation, like this will be the platform where the game will be released, development-wise it'll take a grand total of this amount, when the game will be released, the cost for marketing, PR will take this much, and the projected profit will be around this much. But I can tell you that I wouldn't want to look at the first week's sales for Final Fantasy 16, he laughed. So it seems that even Yoshi P didn't expect a strong amount of sales for Final Fantasy 16 coming out of the gate. And while we can speculate really heavy on if 3.25 million is a real number or not, with all the negativity that surrounds whether or not the game was a financial failure, if the game was selling well, we would know about it. It really is that simple. Publicly traded companies benefit directly from talking about how well their products are doing. If they can produce any numbers that show they are doing well and sales are up, they will do it because that has a direct positive benefit on their stock prices. What the market doesn't like is uncertainty. So if there is a positive update to be shared, then they would share it because otherwise you're just creating uncertainty for yourself and allowing other people to write the narrative for you about the game's performance. Basically, if there is something positive to clarify, they would clarify it because the misinformation would simply be too harmful. This is not to say that I think 3.23 million is necessarily the most accurate number, as again, even though this is a Square Enix stakeholder, it's still not directly from Square Enix and it's not official numbers, and I feel pretty confident in saying that it's probably not at 5 million. However, if 3.23 million is an accurate number, that would make it one of the worst selling mainline Final Fantasy games ever, even trailing behind pre-FF7 titles like Final Fantasy VI, which sold 3.48 million units between its Super Nintendo and PlayStation 1 versions. And even if it is at 4 million, that would still put it behind things like the initial run of Final Fantasy IX, which sold 5 million units on PS1, Final Fantasy XII, which sold 7 million units on its PS2 release, Final Fantasy XIII, which sold 7 million as well on its PlayStation 3 release, or Final Fantasy VII Remake, which also belongs to the 7 million club. And while I know it's a meme to say a Square Enix game didn't meet expectations, after all the company is always saying that isn't something they would lie about, as flagship titles not meeting expectations that directly negatively impacts their stock prices. Of course, one of the biggest elephants in the rooms with the sales of these games has to do with the platform exclusivity, and this is something that 3D Investment Partners has also pointed out. They highlighted that Final Fantasy VII Rebirth and 16 launched when the PS5 had around 60 million units sold. This is a steep decrease from when Final Fantasy VII Remake launched on PS4 and 113 million PS4s were sold, Final Fantasy 15 having 72 million PS4s and 34 million Xbox Ones for a total of 106 million, compared to Capcom's Monster Hunter World and Monster Hunter Rise, which launched on multiple platforms, which allowed them to see bigger sales. This is already being worked on, however, I don't think that multi-platform is the core issue with Final Fantasy sales. After all, with the exclusion of Final Fantasy 13 and 15, the non-MMO mainline entries have been exclusive since 7. Even then, Final Fantasy VII Remake still sold about as much as Final Fantasy 13, an exclusive game versus a multi-platform game. The exclusivity is definitely not helping, and is something that they need to get rid of. And while I do think it will boost sales, it's not the core problem that Final Fantasy has right now. However, it is this slide in particular that people are absolutely furious about. They label Dragon Quest III Remake as outdated and frustrating, and they call Final Fantasy XVI low quality that betrays fan expectations. The funny thing is that the reviews here are literally just one guy's reviews that they broke apart into multiple quotes to make it look like this was from multiple negative reviews. Now, of course, for each game, you can definitely find bad user scores on Metacritic for the games. However, it is a little slimy and disingenuous, and also just completely, utterly lazy to take one guy's user review and then just break it into multiple different quotes for each game, rather than finding any substantial negative criticisms of either game. And while Final Fantasy XVI is an incredibly divisive game, and while there are plenty of people who love it, there are also plenty of people who don't, Dragon Quest III Remake seems to have been really well received. Putting DQ3 on here just absolutely is puzzling to me. As far as FF16 goes, I also feel like the choice of comments that they picked are just ridiculous. I will be the first to admit that I'm extraordinarily critical of this game, and I think in multiple ways it was a fundamental wrong step for the series. However, I don't even think the most critical people of the game would describe low quality as being the primary issue. I also think that putting the quote here that the music which FF is famous for is replaced by generic orchestral cinematic fantasy strings the whole time is a bit ridiculous. While I do prefer Soken's work on Final Fantasy XIV, I can't say that 16 doesn't have any bangers. Again, even as someone who has a lot of criticism of that game, it still would not be in my top 200 complaints. The next slide, however, talks about Forspoken, Babylon's Fall, and Marvel's Avengers, and you know what? They are completely right to deep fry these games. I don't think we need to spend much time on this, but especially Babylon's Fall and Avengers, just absolute garbage. The next slide is on advertising and promotion expense per unit sold. Square Enix has to spend a lot more money to sell a unit of their game compared to their competitors, at least according to this. Dragon's Dogma 2 and Final Fantasy XVI sold roughly the same amount, and yet Capcom had to spend half the amount of money in order to get a single unit sold. But this slide is where things get even more crazy. They have data on the awareness of each IP, and Final Fantasy absolutely dominates, with there being more brand awareness for Final Fantasy in North America than Diablo, Elden Ring, Monster Hunter, Baldur's Gate, Genshin Impact, and Shin Megami Tensei. And yet, these sales do not reflect that at all. But it is funny, if you look at the Magic the Gathering collaboration, that was one of their best collaborations ever, even beating out things like the MCU and Lord of the Rings. It was extremely profitable, and it goes to show that people do, in fact, still love Final Fantasy. But for whatever reason, they are not buying Final Fantasy games. I don't think that this is a single factor, and I think that this is multifactorial for sure, and I think that everyone has their opinions on why that is the case, and I'd love to see your assessment of this in the comments below. They also point out that Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest are not leveraging their cross-media strategy. In other words, they're saying there's no Final Fantasy movies. Multimedia projects for Final Fantasy, and maybe Square Enix as a whole, have a really bad name to them to fans. And some people are not ready for another movie that they need to watch in order to understand a game, or God forbid, another Spirits Within. However, video game film adaptations are different nowadays. Cyberpunk Edgerunners, Fallout, Castlevania, the first season of The Last of Us, and the list goes on and on and on. Good video game adaptations are a thing now, and they've been known to tremendously boost the sales of games when they're well done. So I do think it's time for Final Fantasy to debut on Netflix in some form. A live action series would be way too expensive and way too hard to get right. However, a proper animated series, much like Edgerunners, could have the same effect. One of the other major numbers talked about in here is the development cost of Final Fantasy games, where they note that Square Enix spends a lot more than their competitors in order to make these games. The price is given in yen, however, I've converted it to US dollars on the screen. I must remind you again that these estimates don't come directly from Square Enix, but from one of their investors who has maybe an agenda, as we'll talk about later. But according to them, Final Fantasy VII Remake cost cost an estimated $134 million, Final Fantasy VII Rebirth cost an estimated $119 million, Forspoken $88 million, Final Fantasy XVI a somehow cheap $58 million, Dragon's Dogma 2 $67 million, and Monster Hunter Rise only $18 million. If this is true, Final Fantasy XVI is an incredibly cheap game to make at only $58 million. However, I don't think this is the case. For starters, Yoshi P himself has commented that mainline Final Fantasy, when referring to Final Fantasy XVI, has development costs that normally exceed $100 million. I asked Jacob Novick, a former director of business at Square Enix, and his reply was, "I don't think the production cost for Final Fantasy XVI is real." To your point, if Final Fantasy XVI sold that much on a sub $100 million budget, they would be in much greener pastures and not need this kind of dressing down. Another thing is that Square Enix received money from Sony, and it's entirely possible that Square Enix got a better deal for Final Fantasy XVI than they got for Final Fantasy VII. Overall, while the estimates for the Final Fantasy VII games make sense, the estimate for Final Fantasy XVI just seems to be wrong. And ultimately, if you are going to accept that estimate as truth, then you also have to accept the estimate that the game has only sold 3.25 million units. There is just unfortunately no way to cherry pick this one. Another interesting tweet from Jacob Novick on the matter is, quote, "One thing people do not realize about Square Enix is that the actual float of the stock, the number of freely available shares, is quite small. 3DIP bought up many of the shares over the last year in its run to get nearly 15% of the company and become its second largest shareholder. Unlike a short seller, they want the price to go up. They need to unlock value. They are actually closely aligned with what many of the fans want, which is a Square Enix running at its prime. I think the company can get there with the right management philosophy." I then asked him, "Jacob, I just want to say I have a great deal of appreciation for how you've helped us make sense of Square Enix's current situation. I'd like to ask in what ways you think it aligns with what the fans want. I think I already have an understanding, but I want to be sure." He then was courteous enough to reply to me again, saying, "That's a good question. At the end of the day, I think of it like any CEO thinks of how his company works. 1. When your sales aren't meeting expectations and your margins are behind your competitors, you become risk averse. 2. This means you create safe content and don't expand your business. 3. Great creators leave. So what they need is for the business to get back to sales that are profitable. This means high quality, but smaller dev teams and smaller dev cycles. Not thinking that they are going to compete with the Call of Duties of the world, but with the Claire Obscures of the world and really innovate on gameplay." It's extraordinarily difficult to refute this argument. Since Final Fantasy XIII, Square Enix has been trying to reach an even broader audience than they currently are, increasingly making the games more action-oriented in order to appeal to a bigger audience. But thus far, that audience has proven that it's not showing up. And all the meanwhile, they are jeopardizing their current existing audience. It's funny because people will argue that it's the boomers that don't like Final Fantasy XVI's new combat and can't accept change. But in reality, the people who love the game are the boomers, and the people who hate the game are also the boomers. Guys, there is no younger audience. It is overwhelmingly people in, at the very earliest, their late 20s, all the way up to people in their early 40s, arguing about Final Fantasy. But for the most part, it's really people in their 30s. And currently, the strategy that they have has just been dividing their existing fan base that isn't growing, making extraordinarily polarizing choices that continues to divide that base even further. That is the core issue with the FF brand. 1, it's not growing, and 2, they continue to make half of that base disappointed with a lot of their decisions. Make no mistake, there are definitely people who love games like Final Fantasy XVI, but you'll quickly find out that the modern Final Fantasy titles have been much more divisive, and I say this as someone who doesn't even dislike all of them. I really enjoy the re-trilogy games, 13-2, and I enjoy Final Fantasy XIV. I have a love-hate relationship as well with Final Fantasy 15, but I think the reality here is quite clear. And on the note that Square Enix is not competing with Call of Duty, they're competing with games like Claire Obscure, I completely agree. Although it's not just Claire Obscure, although that's the easiest comparison to make, it's also games like Persona 5, which has reached 10 million, And funny enough, Dragon Quest, a game which cost way less to produce than Final Fantasy does, and each entry is way less divisive than every post-10 entry. Because of this, they've been steadily growing their sales, with Dragon Quest XI reaching 8.5 million units sold, and a large percentage of that is Japan alone, and you can bet that Dragon Quest XII will sell just as much, if not more. Going back to E33, however, it's kind of hard to deny that this game is comparable to a Final Fantasy game, all while costing tremendously less than what an FF game does. And one of the big reasons for why it costs less, God, they're gonna hate me for saying it, is because it's turn-based. Action games cost way more to make than turn-based games do, especially high-quality AAA action games. There is basically no universe where an action version of Clair Obscur exists and it's to the same quality as the current version and also costs the same amount of money. There's a reason that most indie and small studio RPGs will focus on turn-based combat to over action. It is that much cheaper to produce. So that is definitely something that they could explore in order to keep costs down. I know a lot of people will read this as a turn-based purist comment, so let me just say that the Final Fantasy VII Re-Trilogy combat system is like the best combat system ever made. But if we're talking about a practical option to keep the cost down and using a system that their fans would readily accept, many actively love, it is an option. That's a factually true statement. I'm not sure why it's so controversial to make it, but it always is. While I don't think most of 3D Investment Partners' numbers are completely accurate, and there are definitely some disingenuous comparisons inside of this document, I don't think that the macro of what they're saying is wrong. Square Enix is definitely behind other major publishers in Japan. This is something that is observable by everyone, and them modeling Capcom is an absolute must. They have to get costs under control and they have to get sales up. That is simply the bottom line, and that's what 3D Investment Partners outlines here for us. But these are just my thoughts on it. Leave me a comment below telling me yours, and I will see you all in the next video.